In 1415, a man walked into the flames for refusing to confess a crime he didn't believe he committed. His name was Jan Hus, a preacher, a scholar, a reformer. They burned him to silence him. But fire doesn't silence truth. It spreads it. And when the flames died, an army rose. Not knights, not nobles, not kings, peasants. Merchants, artisans, women, priests, and warriors who had never held a sword until faith forced one into their hands. In a world ruled by emperors and popes, they won battles no one believed they could fight. This is the story of the only war in medieval Europe where ordinary Christians defeated the Crusaders sent to destroy them. This is the story of the Hussite Wars and the martyr whose death ignited a holy rebellion. At the dawn of the 15th century, Europe wasn't a land of kings and glory. It was a continent in crisis. The Black Death had killed a third of the population. Wars tore kingdoms apart. Famine haunted the poor. Corruption infected the church at every level. Popes fought other popes. Kings fought their priests. Villagers paid taxes to both and starved anyway. And in this world of chaos, one question echoed across Europe. Where is God in all of this? The church claimed to know, but its answers grew weaker as its palaces grew larger. Something had to crack. And it did. In a place few expected. Bohemia. Unlike most medieval kingdoms, Bohemia was educated, prosperous, and proud. Prague had one of Europe's first universities. Merchants traded with every major city. Peasants had more rights than many nobles elsewhere. But beneath the surface, resentment boiled. The German clergy dominated the church hierarchy. Foreign priests controlled local parishes, and ordinary people were forced to pay for sins they didn't commit to men they didn't trust. Into this world walked a thin, intense preacher with a voice that could split a room in half. Jan Hus. Hus wasn't a revolutionary. Not at the beginning. He simply asked questions the church didn't like answering. Why are priests rich while the people starve? Why are indulgences sold like salvation is a business? Why does Rome demand obedience but refuses accountability? Why is truth treated as a threat? He preached in Czech, the language of the people, not Latin, the language of the elite. Crowds filled churches to hear him. Women, peasants, craftsmen, students. People the church considered too simple to understand theology. But they understood corruption, and they understood Hus. To the people, he was a prophet. To the church, he was a problem. A very dangerous problem. Hus didn't intend to challenge Rome. But every sermon he gave highlighted the gap between what the church preached and what it practiced. He inspired students, nobles, military captains, commoners, entire towns. Bohemia was dividing into two worlds. Those loyal to Rome, who believed obedience was salvation. Those loyal to Hus, who believed truth was salvation. And the more Hus preached, the more dangerous this division became, because Hus offered something Rome could not suppress. Hope. Hope that faith could be pure again. Hope that corruption wasn't destiny. Hope that Christianity belonged to the people, not the hierarchy. And hope, once awakened, is impossible to control. In 1414, the church summoned Hus to the Council of Constance. They promised him safe conduct, a guarantee no Christian authority could break without breaking its own honor. Hus believed them. He traveled unarmed, alone, with trust stronger than fear. Days after he arrived, they arrested him. Weeks later, they condemned him. Not for crimes, not for violence, not for heresy proven, but for refusing one sentence. I confess that I have taught false doctrine. He would not say it. He would not lie. So they burned him. The church believed Hus's death would restore order, silence dissent, end rebellion, prove that Rome still held the power to decide who spoke and who burned. But Hus didn't scream. He sang. Witnesses said his last words were a prayer. And when the flames consumed him, Bohemia felt something break. Not fear, patience. Because Hus didn't die alone. He took with him the illusion that Rome could kill an idea by killing its messenger, and the people of Bohemia answered with a vow. If Hus died for truth, we will fight for truth. The Hussite Wars did not begin on a battlefield. They began the moment the flames went out, when word reached Prague that Jan Hus had been burned, not tried, not debated, not exiled, but burned alive. Bohemia broke. People wept in churches. Students rioted in the streets. Merchants closed their shops. Nobles gathered in secret councils. Villages rang bells not for mourning, but for warning. The message was clear. If they could burn Hus, they could burn anyone. Hus had preached against corruption. Now corruption had killed him. And every Bohemian felt the flames on their own skin. Rome believed Hus's death would silence rebellion. Instead, it nationalized it. In response to Hus's execution, Bohemian nobles, priests, and commoners did something unprecedented. They rewrote the doctrine. They drafted the 4 Articles of Prague, a manifesto of faith born not from popes, but from people. 1. Communion in both kinds, bread and wine. For everyone, not just clergy. 2. Free preaching of the gospel. No priest could be silenced for telling the truth. 3. The church must return to apostolic poverty, no more corruption, no more indulgence trade. 4. Clergy must be punished for sins like any citizen. The law above the church, not the church above the law. For Rome, these demands were heresy. For Bohemia, they were justice. The Hussites now had something Hus never did. A national ideology. The Hussite movement grew so fast, it shocked even its supporters. Villagers formed militias. Priests trained men in churchyards. Women forged weapons in barns. Nobles aligned with the rebels, not because they sought war, but because Rome had already started one. It was no longer simply faith versus empire. It was Bohemia versus the world. And the world noticed. In 1420, Pope Martin V issued a proclamation unlike anything Europe had seen before. A crusade. Not against Muslims, not against pagans, not against invaders, but against Christians, against an entire kingdom that refused to kneel. He declared all Hussites heretics, promised salvation to anyone who killed them, summoned the Holy Roman Empire to wipe them out. Germany answered, Austria answered, Hungary answered. Hundreds of knights, armored cavalry, mercenaries marched toward Bohemia. They expected an easy victory. Bohemia had no standing army, no cavalry, no elite knights, no foreign allies. Rome believed Bohemia would break in days. But they had forgotten one thing. People who watched a martyr burn do not fear armies. As Crusader forces massed at Bohemia's borders, a new power emerged within the rebellion. Tabor. Not a city, a symbol, a fortress built on a hilltop, and an idea built on defiance. Its people believed Christ's kingdom should exist now, not in heaven. A world where no noble ruled, no priest oppressed, no king commanded. Equality before God, equality in battle. And at the heart of Tabor was a man the history still whispers. Jan Žižka, old, scarred, battle-hardened, soon to be blind in one eye. But Žižka saw clearer than any general in Europe. He understood something no Crusader commander grasped. Bohemia didn't need cavalry. It needed conviction. And conviction was something the Hussites had more than anyone else. By midsummer, a massive Crusader coalition surrounded Bohemia. Armies from Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, knights in polished armor. War horses trained for shock charges. Crossbowmen, siege engines, mercenaries. An overwhelming force, a machine of war, against them. Farmers with flails, miners with hammers, priests with banners, women carrying stones, men who had watched their prophet die in flames. It was not an equal war. It was not even a fair war. But the Hussites had one advantage their enemies did not. They were already prepared to die. This wasn't rebellion anymore. This was vengeance made holy. And at that moment, standing between the Crusaders and the heart of Bohemia, Žižka unveiled an invention that would shock Europe and turn peasants into the most feared army of the 15th century. When the Crusader armies advanced into Bohemia, they expected terrified peasants. What they saw stopped them in silence. Wagons, hundreds of them, arranged in circles, linked by chains, covered with shields, braced with pikes. They looked like a moving fortress, a wooden wall in the middle of open fields. This was Žižka's creation, the Wagenburg, the war wagon fortress. It was simple, brilliant, terrifying, and it would become the nightmare of every knight in Europe. Medieval warfare depended on one truth. Knights win battles. Heavy cavalry, armored nobles, war horses trained to crash into infantry. For centuries, no peasant army survived a cavalry charge. But Žižka rewrote that rule. The war wagon used crossbowmen, handgunners, pikemen, shield-bearers, slingers, priests singing battle hymns, all protected behind moving barricades. It turned peasants into devastating defensive units. Knights who charged the wagons met volleys of bolts, early firearms, long pikes, flails and hooks, mud traps, and fire. A knight charging at full speed would crash into a wall of wood and iron and die under peasant hammers. The old world of warfare collapsed in front of it. In March 1420, the Crusader army marched on Prague. Tens of thousands of armored troops charged the hills around Vítkov. And on the ridge, heavily outnumbered, surrounded on three sides, stood Žižka with a few hundred men. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became legend. The Crusaders charged uphill into mud, bolts, rocks, arrows, gunfire, and the deafening roar of Hussite battle hymns. Žižka's men held their ground. The wagons locked the ridge, and when the Crusaders broke formation, Hussite infantry counterattacked with brutal precision. The first crusade against the Hussites collapsed in a single day. Europe could not believe it. Peasants defeated knights. Heretics defeated a crusade. Bohemia defeated an empire. Rome was humiliated. and Europe trembled. After Vitkov, Crusader coalitions returned again and again. 1421, 1422, 1423, 1424, and 1425. They brought knights from across Europe, Teutonic veterans, mercenaries from Italy, Hungarian cavalry, imperial armies, papal legates, new crusade proclamations. But Žižka defeated every one of them. Every single one. Even after losing his second eye and going completely blind, he commanded armies by memory, by sound, by instinct. And he never lost a battle. Not once. History knows very few undefeated generals. Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Subutai, Khalid ibn al-Walid, and a blind peasant commander named Jan Žižka. European knights refused to change. They believed cavalry was God's chosen weapon. But Hussites used terrain, wagons, early firearms, battlefield engineering, coordinated infantry waves. The Crusaders used pride, tradition, and cavalry charges that no longer worked. Every time they charged, they died. Every time they regrouped, the wagons moved. Every time they prayed, Hussites sang louder. They were outmatched not by numbers, but by innovation. For Crusader knights, the war was honor. For Žižka's army, the war was survival. And survival is stronger than honor. The Hussites believed they were fighting for Hus's memory, the purity of the gospel, the right to preach, the right to live without corruption. A Bohemia free from foreign domination. Every battle hymn they sang shook the Crusaders' morale. Every victory confirmed what Europe feared. Heresy was winning. Chroniclers from France, Italy, Austria, Poland described Žižka's victories with a mixture of awe and horror. Kings demanded explanations. Popes demanded new crusades. Commanders blamed each other. No one admitted the truth. They were being defeated by people they considered inferior in every way. Socially, militarily, theologically. A blind general, a wagon fortress, a peasant army fueled by a martyr's last prayer. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. Again and again. And the greatest humiliation was still to come. Because soon, the Crusaders wouldn't just lose, they would run. This is the part where Europe learns a truth it never wanted to admit. Bohemia was not the problem. Bohemia was the warning. After humiliating defeats, Europe did what Europe always did when faced with inconvenient reality. It doubled down. Rather than rethink tactics, Pope Martin V called for another crusade. Knights swore new vows. Kings promised new troops. Preachers shouted from pulpits that the Hussites were devils disguised as men. Armies marched again, heavier, angrier, certain that numbers alone would crush the heresy. But numbers don't win wars. Understanding does. And Europe understood nothing. At Usti, Crusader forces outnumbered the Hussites 3-1. The knights charged downhill, a cavalry dream, until it became a cavalry grave. Hussites ambushed them with wagons hidden behind a ridge. Gunfire, flails, pikes, counterattacks timed to perfection. The knights shattered like glass under a hammer. Men fled. Banners fell. Commanders died where they stood. The battle was over before it truly began. Europe's military pride died on that hill. Desperate, the Pope called the Fifth Crusade against the Hussites. It was the largest yet. tens of thousands of troops, reinforcements from half of Europe, a professional army with siege weapons and elite cavalry. They marched confidently into Bohemia. And then something happened that became legend. They heard the Hussites coming. Not an army. A sound, a wall of voices singing the Hussite battle hymn, "Ye who are warriors of God." A song so powerful, so unified, so utterly fearless, that it froze the Crusader army in place. Men looked at each other and saw terror reflected back. They didn't stay to fight. They ran. An entire crusade, tens of thousands, fled the battlefield before a single sword was drawn. Europe had never seen anything like it, and would never see anything like it again. The Hussites defeated a crusade with a hymn. In 1424, Jan Žižka, the undefeated general, died of plague. His men wept as if Bohemia itself had died. But Žižka had prepared them for this moment. He left behind trained commanders, disciplined wagon crews, a tactical doctrine, a national spirit, an army that fought like a faith. His followers said, "Let God strike us dead if we fear the living." And with or without Žižka, they fought on, and they won. By the early 1430s, something extraordinary happened. Europe stopped asking how to defeat the Hussites. It began asking whether defeating them was even possible. Armies were exhausted, treasuries drained, nobles furious at endless defeats, kings embarrassed, popes frustrated, and worst of all, soldiers no longer believed the war was winnable. Every crusade ended the same way. Death, retreat, humiliation. Europe had thrown everything it had at Bohemia, and Bohemia was still standing. The church finally saw the pattern. You can burn a man. You can condemn a doctrine. You can summon an army. But you cannot destroy a movement that believes God is on its side, especially when that movement keeps winning. After a decade of war and 5 failed crusades, Rome faced the one outcome it feared most: negotiation. Not victory, not dominance, not punishment. Negotiation with the heretics. But before peace could happen, Bohemia would face its most painful battle yet. A battle not against crusaders, but against itself. Because revolutions don't die in defeat. They die in division. Victory had united Bohemia, but victory also revealed the cracks beneath. There were now 2 Hussite factions. The Utraquists, moderate, nobles supported, wanted reform, not revolution. The Taborites, radical, peasant supported, wanted a new world, not a repaired one. Both claimed to defend Hus. Both believed God was with them. Neither trusted the other. Rome did not need to destroy the Hussites. The Hussites were preparing to destroy themselves, and that is how empires always retake what they have lost. Not through strength, through patience. But the final blow, the one history never forgets, would come in Part 5, where a movement built on unity collapses under the weight of its own victory. Revolutions are undefeated until they face themselves. By 1432, Bohemia had done the impossible. It defeated the Holy Roman Empire. It defeated multiple crusades. It defeated every coalition Europe assembled. It terrified kings. It humiliated popes. It rewrote the laws of war. But victory changes movements faster than defeat. The question was no longer, can Bohemia survive? It became, Who gets to decide what Bohemia becomes? And that question was more dangerous than any crusader army. The Hussite movement split cleanly into two worlds. The Utraquists, moderate nobles and clergy, wanted peace, wanted political stability, wanted reform within the existing structure. They believed Hus died for justice, not for revolution. The Taborites radicals, warriors, peasants, believed the world must be remade, not merely corrected. They believed Hus died for liberation, not compromise. One side wanted a new church. One side wanted a new world. You cannot reconcile those visions. You can only collide them. The Pope and Emperor watched the division and smiled. Why waste another crusade when Bohemia was preparing to crush itself? Church envoys offered the Utraquists something irresistible: legitimacy, recognition of Hussite communion, limited religious freedom, political autonomy, protection. All the Utraquists had to do was defeat the radicals. And just like that, Europe turned a holy war into a civil war. Not by force, by patience. The Taborites believed the Utraquists were betraying Hus. Compromise meant corruption. Negotiation meant surrender. Peace with Rome meant peace with the very institution that burned their prophet alive. They would not yield. They would not bend. They were prepared to fight the entire world. And now, they would fight their own brothers. On May 30th, 1434, two Hussite armies met on the fields near Lipany. Veterans who once stood together at Vitkov now pointed weapons at each other. Singers who once raised the same battle hymn now sang in opposing camps. Priests who once prayed for the same victory now prayed for opposite ones. This was not a battle. It was a tragedy. A movement fighting its own shadow. The Taborites were fearless, experienced, battle-hardened, nearly unstoppable behind their war wagons. But at Lipany, the Utraquists used something the Crusaders never had: knowledge. They understood Taborite tactics. They had fought beside them for a decade. They knew their timing, their formations, their expectations. So the Utraquists staged a retreat, a fake collapse. The Taborites, believing victory was near, broke formation to pursue. The war wagons opened, the line stretched, the discipline cracked, and the Utraquist cavalry swung around and struck from behind. For the first time in their history, the Taborites were surrounded. What followed was slaughter, not war. Slaughter. The wagon fortress burned, commanders fell, veterans died where they stood. The radical heart of the movement was cut out in a single afternoon. When the fighting ended, the fields of Lipany were silent. Bodies lay where brothers had killed brothers. The Taborites, the uncompromising believers, the unstoppable warriors, the soul of the rebellion, were gone. Not defeated by Rome, not defeated by crusaders, not defeated by empires, defeated by compromise. The revolution had survived every enemy, except itself. The Utraquists signed the Compactata of Basel, granting Bohemia limited religious freedom, communion in both kinds, political autonomy, recognition of their reforms. It was a victory, but a quiet one. Bohemia kept its faith, but lost its fire. It kept its reforms, but lost its unity. It survived, but the revolution did not. The war that began with a martyr's flames ended with a brother's sword. Even though the movement fractured, Hus's ideas did not die at Lipany. A century later, a German monk named Martin Luther would read Hus's writings and declare, "We are all Hussites without knowing it." The world Hus dreamed of did not rise in his lifetime, nor in the generation after. But the questions he asked about corruption, about conscience, about authority, about truth, would ignite another fire, a fire that would reshape Christianity forever. Victory leaves scars, defeat leaves lessons, but revolutions leave something far more complicated. After Lipany, Bohemia didn't collapse. It didn't kneel. It didn't surrender. It didn't dissolve into the empire that tried to crush it. Bohemia survived, and that alone was a miracle. Even weakened, even divided, even exhausted. It forced the church and empire to negotiate instead of dominate. For the first time in medieval Europe, a grassroots Christian movement won recognition from the institution that condemned it. Bohemia emerged not victorious, but unchained. That was Hus's first victory. The Compactata of Basel gave Bohemia what Hus died for: communion for all, preaching without censorship, limits on ecclesiastical authority, national autonomy in spiritual life. Rome hated it, but Rome signed it, because Rome didn't have a choice. The Hussites had done what no medieval movement had ever achieved. They bent the church without breaking their faith. This was Hus's second victory. After the wars, a strange calm fell over the land. Prague rebuilt, villages repopulated, trade resumed. But something felt it unfinished. Hus had lit a fire meant to purify faith. Instead, that fire burned his followers as much as his enemies. The Taborites' dream was gone. Žižka's discipline was gone. Bohemia no longer sang battle hymns that made armies flee. But the ideas remained. And ideas, unlike revolutions, do not die in civil wars. They wait. A century later, a monk hammered his theses onto a church door in Wittenberg. Martin Luther. He challenged indulgences. He challenged corruption. He challenged authority. He challenged the church on the very ground Jan Hus had stood 100 years earlier. When Luther read Hus's writings, he said, "Hus was right, and we are all Hussites now." Hus's questions became Luther's rebellion. Luther's rebellion became the Reformation. The Reformation became the fracture of Western Christianity. And it all began with a preacher burned for refusing to lie. This was Hus's third victory. The Hussite Wars were not a footnote in medieval chaos. They were a warning. You cannot kill reform by killing reformers. You cannot silence truth by silencing its messengers. You cannot control faith with force, because faith does not die in fire. Faith ignites. Hus was meant to be erased. Instead, he became a spark. Žižka was meant to be a footnote. Instead, he became undefeated legend. Bohemia was meant to be punished. Instead, it became precedent. Empires learn slowly. Institutions learn reluctantly. But history learns immediately. And it never forgets the people who die for what they believe. They burned Jan Hus to stop a fire. But they forgot a simple truth. Fire spreads upward. Ideas spread everywhere. A man they tried to erase became the voice of a nation. A death meant to frighten became a rallying cry. A trial meant to silence became the hymn of armies that defeated Crusades. The Hussite Wars were not just battles. They were a mirror a mirror showing Europe what happens when ordinary people realize that faith does not belong to popes, to emperors, to councils, to crowns. Faith belongs to the conscience of the believer. Empires can crush armies. They can tear down cities. They can declare crusades. But they cannot force a heart to believe a lie. Hus died in fire. Žižka died undefeated. The Taborites died betrayed. Bohemia survived divided. But the truth they carried walked forward. Into Luther, into Reformations, into revolutions, into every moment in history where people stood and said, "My conscience is not for sale." The Hussite Wars ended in 1434. But the question they asked has never ended. What happens when faith and power no longer speak the same language? History answers that question again and again. But it began in a square in Constance, with a preacher who refused to rewrite his truth, and with a fire that reshaped the world.